You are on 94.9 this morning, and I have Dr. John on the line this morning. Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick. I'm finding it pretty hard to hear you, but there you go.
Yes, well, it's at least you can hear me a little bit. Of course, Dr. John, you're from Creation Ministries International. You guys have your own website, creation.com, and there's thousands of pages of information on there. However, we'd love to answer people's questions right here on air. And so we're just sort of appealing to everybody to send your questions through to our text line 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. John, I'm sorry you're not in the studio this week, but that's how things go during this lockdown. How are you going?
I'm going well, Mick, and of course, we're reverting to what we did times last year because we're in the same sort of situation that we can't come to the studio, but we're making it work, and hopefully everybody can hear what I've got to say.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Dr. John, what are we talking about this week?
Well, look, I thought I'd start off. Remember last week we gave quite a big plug to a Zoom presentation that Creation Ministries was holding last Tuesday night.
Yes, absolutely, about the flood.
That's right, and that was Dr. Taz Walker, who's one of our Brisbane-based speakers, and he works in the Brisbane head office. And what the people who tuned in would have heard and seen is that all the evidence actually points to a world that's been shaped by some catastrophe. Mm-hmm. Now, and that catastrophe really had to have been global in extent. Now, when you think about it, that's totally contrary to what the science of geology was founded on, and what geology actually believed until fairly recently, because geology really has been forced to admit that the slow and steady processes that were put forward as the way the world was shaped right when geology was founded, they really won't stand up to scrutiny. Mm-hmm. And the founders of modern geology, people like James Hutton and Charles Lyell, I mean, they put forward their ideas 200 years ago, but it's now obvious that that was wrong. And it might not matter except for the influence that they've had not only on geology but also on life itself. Because Lyell, who was one of them, he was a huge influence on Charles Darwin. Mm-hmm. And when Darwin went on his voyage around the world, he took Lyell's book, well, probably the earliest book on geology ever written. He took that with him, and that gave him the idea of long ages and very, very slow, gradual, steady processes, and that's how the whole idea of long ages and evolution ever got off the ground. And of course, that's having profound impact even to this day. And those initial founders certainly wouldn't have accepted a global flood, because that would have been far too close to what the Bible's always said. But I think people who tuned in last week would have seen that it was obvious from what Dr. Walker presented that the same appearances are everywhere. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, you find exactly the same sort of thing everywhere, and it's pretty obvious that water was involved. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that he showed on that meeting last week was the way some of these dinosaur trackways that we find embedded in rock, the way they were formed. And, of course, he showed a lot of, not photos, but artists' impressions, and these are the secular artists who've made a bit of a drawing of what they think might have been going on. And the animals that they've depicted in these drawings are obviously terrified. They're clearly fleeing away from rising waters, and a lot of the same species were buried in sediment in that what they call opisthotic pose. where they've been trapped and their heads thrown back and they can't escape. The terror pose really of an animal that's dying, and really it's anybody with a familiarity with what they call the geological column in books can see that it doesn't really represent what the books say it represents. That is a sequence of evolution over time. It's obviously the way things got buried in the same global event. And when you see all these examples that were shown on Zoom last week, you can see it becomes completely obvious to you.
Absolutely. And I believe they're doing these things every couple of weeks, aren't they, Dr. John?
They are, Mick. It's going to be a regular event, I think fortnightly at this stage. But anybody who goes to the website, just Google creation.com, you'll see that they are advertising these things pretty regularly. And I would encourage listeners, particularly listeners who've got children at school. They really need to tune into these because the children are not going to hear this sort of stuff any other way.
Yeah.
Unless they get it from an organisation like Creation Ministries, all they're going to hear at school is the traditional long ages, millions and billions of years, how we evolved, all of that sort of thing. So it's very important for school-age children to be watching.
Absolutely. We have Dr. John on the phone from Creation Ministries International, who's been talking to us about the program they had on Creation Ministries on air, but on the internet last Tuesday night. They're doing it every Tuesday. It's sort of a giant Zoom meeting where people get to ask questions at the end, which is cool. But they have pictures as well as sound, and they were talking about, well, pretty much about the flood and all those visible things that we can see that just prove the flood was real.
Yeah, and look, I thought one of the other interesting things, Mick, was that where you find a whole lot of dinosaurs of the same type buried together. And I mean, we've got a lot of those places in Australia. We've got it up at Winton. We've got it here in New South Wales, over at Coober Pedy in South Australia. And wherever you go, you always find that the explanation is that there must have been once an inland sea. Now, that's the same all over the world. There's always the explanation that there must have been an inland sea. Well, how many inland seas can you have? I mean, doesn't it make sense, really? Because what it is saying is that everywhere was covered with water at some stage, you see. And obviously, the flood would be the best explanation. But the other point, I think, is that the burial of all these creatures is in stone. Now, when I say stone, we're talking about sedimentary rock. And look, I mean, it's everywhere here in the Sydney region, isn't it? We've got sedimentary rock all over the place. People go and collect bush rock to decorate their gardens, and bush rock is just the surface of it chipped off. But underneath, you might even have, in some places in the world, kilometres of this sedimentary rock. Now, where did all this sediment come from? You know, I mean, sediment obviously gets precipitated out of water. And without a global flood, how could you possibly get the amount of sedimentary rock that we've got all over the world?
Yeah.
And when you look at all the enormous canyons and ravines and valleys, they've obviously been carved by massive water flow. Now, you look down the bottom of a valley or a canyon, and what you see is the river down the bottom, but it's obvious that the river is very much smaller than the valley or the canyon that it flows through. And it really couldn't possibly have cut it. What it is the leftover of the torrential water flow that did cut it, you know? And when you have a look at examples where those things are forming even today, you find that that's the explanation. There's a massive water flow and there's a creek or something down the bottom that's the leftover.
Absolutely. We are with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International talking about evidence of the flood and evidence that's really, really hard to knock back. I mean, for some scientists, though, of course, they're doing their best to come up with other theories. But we've seen evidence, even driving to Sydney on the side of the road and on the Hawkesbury, of all that sediment. And we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And Dr. John, over the last few weeks, we learnt a little bit about you and your past in the Navy. And I guess from my point of view, I see you now as the James Bond type, a man without fear, a man who can pretty much, swing into battle on seriously, swinging between two ships is pretty cool when you're travelling from one ship to another ship on a zip line during big seas and ships sailing at full steam. Pretty interesting stuff, but I guess I'm interested. How did you sort of just go from, James Bond to, hey, I want to see what this God bloke's all about, or Christianity's all about, or the flood's all about? How did that all change for you?
Yeah, well, look, Mick, it is interesting, isn't it? And one of the reasons why I'm so taken with an organisation like Creation Ministries and its focus on the flood and geology and evolution and so on, one of the reasons is that for the first part, more than half of my time in the Navy, I wasn't a Christian. And a lot of the things that I had to go through, the training and the operations and so on, were a bit hazardous. And
to say the least.
When I look back on it, it's quite scary because I now know what the eternal consequences would have been if I hadn't survived. Now, by the grace of God, I did survive long enough for him to get through to me. But look, one of the reasons why I've been so attracted to Creation Ministries and why I've been involved with them for so long is that the issues they focus on are issues that were a real problem to me. I had become quite a convinced atheist, and that was partly due to my medical studies and background and so on. And when I'd read the biology books and all the other textbooks that we had, I read about all the supposed proofs of evolution. You picked up a book and you saw how there were all these drawings of how the horse supposedly had evolved. And then one of the things that was even mentioned in my time in medical school was these embryos, the sequence of embryos that you find in biology textbooks. And this was taught as evidence of evolution. But of course, it's actually been discredited now for at least 50 years, and everybody knows that simply isn't true, and that those drawings were faked. The guy who put them forward deliberately misrepresented it to make it look as though it was an example of evolution. Yep. And then I read in one of the textbooks the story of the peppered moths in England, the moths that seem to be changing colour over time, and that was put forward as an example of evolution in action. And I didn't have any idea that that was going to be discredited as well. And the reason it was discredited is because the photographic so-called evidence was all staged. It wasn't real. And so these things, along with all the millions and billions of years, they were things that I'd accepted and that I'd believed. And when you become a Christian, some of those things just don't automatically disappear. I could immediately see the discrepancy between the millions and billions of years and what the Bible taught about times and ages. And I really had to find a satisfying explanation for it. And I asked people, and I got all these sorts of explanations that never really made any sense to me. And it wasn't until somebody lent me a book called The Genesis Flood. Now, I think you can probably still get it. It's a fairly old book. It was written well over about 60 years ago by a theologian and a geologist. And a lot of the information in it now is a bit old hat because there's a lot more. But what that book showed me was that the flood and what the flood caused was the obvious answer. And when you think about it, biblical history perfectly explains the geological formations and whatever that we see everywhere, whereas conventional geology just doesn't.
Absolutely. We are with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, and we're learning what changed his mind from atheist and the regular Aussie James Bond to a Christian Ministries International speaker, and it's a very interesting story. And we have Dr. John on the line from Creation Ministries International, who's been telling us about his life. Of course, Dr. John was Surgeon Commander for the Royal Australian Army and did some pretty crazy things as a younger doctor. And he became a Christian from being an atheist partway through. And he's telling us his story about what changed all that.
You said Army, Mick. I got to go back and say it was the senior service, the Navy.
Yeah. Yeah. The Army don't go in submarines, do they?
No, that's correct. But look, it wasn't the evidence for geology and the flood that convinced me. The Lord himself convinced me over the truth of Jesus' resurrection. That was really what transformed me from being an atheist to a Christian. Mm-hmm. But I then had to find an explanation for what I had formerly believed. And that's where the Creation Ministries and the flood story and so on came in. But look, I think now I look at some of the explanations for the evidence that we see all around us, and it simply doesn't fit the facts. You know, you find that the geologists are really shoehorning the evidence in where it doesn't fit. It's a bit like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, and it just doesn't work. But look, I think people need to remember too that we're not out to be disparaging towards secular scientists. You know, they're honest enough people, and they're trying to find an explanation for things that really is consistent without a creator God. And we don't believe that you can do that, but people genuinely try to do it. But the reason why we emphasise how the secular explanations don't fit the observed facts is we're trying to show people that when you look at the Bible's history, the observed facts actually do fit that history. And when you know that the Bible's history is reliable, you can then look at the story of Jesus and the story of the forgiveness and salvation that he offers, and because it comes from a book that is demonstrably reliable, then you can believe that as well. And it's very important because our eternal future is at stake. That's what I mentioned before. It's scary when I look back at the sort of things that I went through and could have died in them and wasn't a believer. What my fate would have been. That really is awful. Mm. And that's really what it's all about. We're not going to be judged on our knowledge of geology, but we are going to be judged on whether or not we have accepted the salvation and forgiveness that Jesus offers. And we're unlikely to take that story seriously if we've been convinced by the secular world that the book that it comes out of is really just a collection of fairy tales. And that's why this issue is so important. I know from first-hand experience that belief in a world evolutionary history, which is contrary to the Bible, that completely blocked me from taking the Jesus event seriously, you know? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I find that with in discussions with a lot of young people after the talks. They've been so convinced by the world and what they've learnt at school that the secular history is true, that they find it hard to take Jesus' claims as true. And it's really the same for the average person in the street. You talk to somebody in the street and they'll say, "Oh, I'm not interested in that, I'm not religious." Well, what they're really saying is that they've been convinced by the arguments that there probably isn't any God or life after death, and so they're not really interested in the story of Jesus. And it is so important. And that's the greatest lie and deception of the devil. And it's typified, I think, by what we read in Thessalonians, that the condemnation that will come to people is because they did not receive the love of the truth. People really need to be seeking after truth. And unfortunately, we live in a world where truth is not regarded as absolute anymore. It's relative. People can say, well, that's your truth, but my truth is a bit different. Well, you can't have two different types of truth. Truth is truth, and it is not relative, it is absolute. And so, unfortunately, I have to keep focusing on the truth of the Bible's history, because that demonstrates the truth of the Jesus event, and that's the most important thing.
Absolutely. And that really is what Creation Ministries is doing. So you've come through I guess, a search and discovery which led you to CMI, and you thought, wow, there's a lot of other people that need this as well.
Well, they do, Mick, and that's why we constantly promote on this segment. We promote the Creation Ministries website, creation.com, because we know that people have got lots of questions. And if they have genuine questions, I mean, some people who want to throw in questions are just trying to justify their own belief. But people who are genuinely seeking after truth, if they've got real questions, they can find the answer on creation.com. Yeah. There's a search window. You just have to type in your question, and it'll give you a whole list of articles that are fully referenced that you can read online, you can print out, you can do whatever you like with them. Access is completely free. You don't have to register. You just Google creation.com, use the search window, and you'll be able to find all the answers to your questions. But of course, as you said many times, Mick, we'd like to get the questions sent in to us.
Absolutely. That number, 0401 949 949. Of course, if you have a question, chances are there's a lot of other listeners with the exact same question. And we love new questions. It gives us more and more to talk about every week. If you have any questions at all on anything to do with creation or evolution or anything like, aliens and dinosaurs, please send them through for Dr. John. Again, that number, SMS 0401 949 949. Dr. John, I thank you so much for another awesome morning.
Yeah, thanks, Mick, and we'll probably have to try it this way again for a couple of weeks, I guess, while we're in this lockdown.
Yes, I guess you're not going anywhere, are you?
No, that's right. We probably ought to tell the listeners what we do. We're on the phone and we're watching each other on Messenger. It's almost like being in the studio.
Yes, it's pretty close, but you sound a tiny bit different. You sound a little bit more like AM radio, Dr. John.
Oh, right, okay. Well, I'm sorry about that.
That's all right. Hey, you're on 94.9 this morning. It is 5 minutes to 9. We'll have the news and weather coming up at 9. Good morning.